What's happening in America's public school classrooms? And there is an intense effort to revise curriculum with every element of the left's wish list. And they're pushing hard. We talked about what's happening in Minnesota. And what's happening in California is just unbelievable. I mean, it would be unbelievable for California. But this is actually finding its way into classrooms all across America. So number one, as a parent, you need to be really engaged with what your children are being exposed to. Secondly, as a citizen in your community, you need to be concerned about what all of the children are being exposed to. And, you know, some people, well, these things are being driven from the state capitol, or it's being driven by the federal government. And true, a lot of it is being driven by, especially under the Biden administration, you know, whole transgender agenda. But that doesn't mean you have to stand for it. Local communities need to rise up and say enough is enough. Now, the federal government, and most people don't realize this, but only about 7% of the funding for public education comes from the federal government. But who knows the percentage? I would say probably it's 60%. Of the guidelines for education come from the federal government. Could be an overstatement. I don't know the exact number, but I can assure you this: they have an outsized influence in relationship to the money that they put toward public education. And then, of course, the state legislatures, the state educational bodies do the same thing. But man, it's time to stand up to those driving this agenda and say, no, we are not going to allow our children to be exposed to this. So as Christians, how should we be viewing this, and how should we be responding to this? And I'm going to continue my conversation with David Clausen, the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview and Christian Ethics at the Family Research Council. And joining us is also Brent Keilen, who is the vice president of FRC Action. Brent, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks, Tony. Good to be with you.
David, let's start with you in terms of how should Christians be viewing this issue of education? What type of responsibility do we have as Christian parents and Christian citizens?
Yeah, I think the first thing, Tony, is that there's a responsibility to be aware of kind of what's going on. So kind of looking at this through the worldview lens, I did a little bit of research, and it's really interesting that 70% of Americans claim to be Christian. Now, I think we'd probably argue that it's probably much lower than that. But nevertheless, 70% of Americans who claim to be Christian, 90% of them send their kids to public school. That means 90% of these children being raised in Christian homes spend 30 to 35 hours in public schools that are typically run by those who don't have a biblical worldview. And we're talking about some of the proposals being made to curriculum. Well, frankly, there's been, over the last couple of decades, all sorts of, things have been introduced into curriculum that are antithetical to biblical Christianity. And Tony, it's being effective. Let me just give you one stat. The Nehemiah Institute regularly tests high school students on their biblical worldview. And what they found out, and at least this was from the 2015 study, it showed that 90% of students from Christian homes that attended public schools scored on their survey that their worldview is actually grounded in the basic tenets of secularism. So again, that's 90% of students from Christian homes actually have a secular worldview. And again, we shouldn't be surprised by this. To paraphrase the apologist Vodi Bakum, if we send our kids to be educated by Caesar, we should have no right to be surprised that they turn out to be Romans. So I think the first thing is to realize exactly what's going on.
Right. But I want to step back just one step. Not only do we need to know what's going on, but we have to realize we have responsibility for it. Because as Christian parents, we can't place our kids on a school bus and then wash our hands of it and say, oh, it's not my responsibility what happens when they get on that bus. It is our responsibility. God has given us, and I've said this many times and I'll say it many more times, He's given us both the responsibility and the authority to train up our children in the way that they should go. We're to talk with them in the way. When we sit down, when we stand up, when we lie down, we're supposed to talk to them, educate them, teach them these things. Now, we can delegate the authority by allowing them to go to Christian school, a public school, but we'll never, ever be able to delegate the responsibility. God will always hold us, ultimately will hold us accountable. And we're the ones, as parents, I've seen this so many times, and I don't want to get on my soapbox here, but I think I will anyway. I talk to so many parents who lament what's happened with their children, and the common denominator is what they were exposed to in their public school that contradicted everything that the parents sought to inculcate, to train, to teach their child both at home and at church. And the school has them far more hours, so many more hours in those classrooms, and it's having a profound effect upon the thinking of, and I'm talking about Christian, profound effects upon the thinking of Christian children.
No, it absolutely is, Tony. And the point that you just made, I think, deserves to be underscored, that if the children are spending 30 to 35 hours in a public school they're being exposed to ungodly and unbiblical beliefs, that simply can't be counteracted by the few hours that parents have at home, or 1 hour at church, or maybe an hour at youth group on a Wednesday or a Sunday night. And so what that does, not only all those hours, not only does that change what you believe, it changes what you love. What's taking place in those classrooms is your children are being learned to love certain things, that there's formation that's taking place. And let me just read one verse, Tony. You're absolutely right. I've said this before. Parents need to realize their chief role is the disciple maker. That parents have that biblical responsibility to be the chief disciple maker in their child's life. You quoted Deuteronomy chapter 6. Another verse is Proverbs 22:6, which says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." And so again, the buck stops with the parents in the home, and it's their responsibility. So that's a responsibility that every parent needs to take very, very seriously, because they will have to give an account to God for how they have discipled their child.
So we have established here there's a responsibility, a spiritual responsibility for parents to know what's going on in the classroom. That, of course, the foundation of that being that they have the responsibility of educating their children, so they need to know what's going on. And if it's a situation in which their children are being indoctrinated, which in most cases probably is, you need to be praying seriously about alternatives to these government schools. I want to bring Brent into the conversation. Brent, I want to talk about the cultural responsibility, because what's happening in these classrooms across America is affecting the culture of our country.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, Tony.
So let's talk about how we can address that issue.
Yes. So, Tony, I think there's several steps, important steps that we can take here. And to follow up with some of the numbers that David shared, 90% of the children in our country go to public school. And that number has taken a bit of a hit due to, what we've seen with the pandemic. But still, the reality is that the overwhelming majority of children for the foreseeable future will be in public schools. And so it's so important that we get involved and roll up our sleeves here. So several things that you can do. I would say start out, be aware and leave nothing to chance. Make sure you know what's going on. Show up at those school board meetings. Do you know who the school board members are for your district? Do you know how to reach out and contact them if some of these questions come up? Have those conversations with your kids. Don't leave that to chance, because a lot of times we say this would never come to my school district. I don't live in one of those leftist areas, but the reality is if it's not there, they will try to get it there at some point. So you need to get out in front of that, and make sure you're addressing that. Some other steps you can take, Tony, you talk about this a lot on your radio show, but I'm going to underscore it again, vote. Voting is so important. Candidates have an enormous impact both at the state and federal level on our education policy. It's important to make sure you know where they stand and you're doing that. Third thing I would say is keep working for the betterment of the education system right in your community. Start right where you're at. And Tony, if I could share a couple examples on this one, I know we've been talking about Minnesota here, and this academic standards review that we've been talking about. Those reviews, those revisions were being conducted by a committee of 38 members across the state of Minnesota, but it included parents, teachers, school board members, business leaders. People could apply last year to be on this committee, and those types of opportunities are out there, but they're very easy to miss if you're not looking for those. We need to be involved in those types of opportunities. One other story here. This also is very recent, but I think very positive, Tony. In North Carolina, the Lieutenant Governor there, Lieutenant Governor Robinson, just announced the creation of a new task force that is aimed at protecting students from indoctrination. And in the words of the task force, they want to ensure our students are being taught how to think, but not what to think. And so they set up this mechanism through the website where parents and students could report complaints if they saw some of this indoctrination taking place. Tony, within a couple days of that website being launched, it went down. The media was speculating that was because they had given up this task force quickly. The reality was the exact opposite. They got so much web traffic within a few days of launching this, it shut the website down. They had to temporarily take that down so they could upgrade it and bolster it and handle more capacity and activity. And I think that's an encouraging sign that there are more and more parents and students becoming aware of what's going on and looking for that outlet, but you can help facilitate that outlet in your community. Know what's going on, know how to connect other people with what's going on in your community. And then, Tony, last thing that I'll mention here is think about running for office, and especially for school board. It is just so important right now. And I can tell you, for those listening to the show right now, some of you have thought about running for office. There are probably other people, a few other people in your church or your community groups who have also thought about running for office. If you don't feel called to run for office, find those that do and support them. They need the help. But this is something, running for office takes time commitment. You have to do some research, but it's also very doable. And it is just so important right now that we have good voices on these school boards.
Yeah, that's critical. And let me address just a couple of aspects of that last point of running for office, especially for school boards. Number one, people say, "Well, my kids are grown. I don't have any kids in school, or my kids aren't in public school, so I don't think I can do it." No, doesn't matter. Your kids are grown. That's fine. Gives you more time to focus on it. Your kids aren't in public school, doesn't matter. I know locally in my community, we had a former chairman of the school board whose kids were homeschooled. They were homeschooled with mine. But he did a great job, well respected. He was a businessman in the community. And so don't let that stand in the way of being a part of changing your local community. And number two, it doesn't cost a lot to run for these offices at the local level. It's very, very doable.
That's right. And Tony, I'll just add a couple of resources here, and we can make sure these get on that website, tonyperkins.com. But there are groups that can help walk you through and give you resources on navigating what does it look like for you to run for office. And these offer great resources. These can be done online. And so we'll make sure to put those there so you can access those, but they can train you everything you need to know. It can be intimidating. They can make sure you have the information that you need. Also, some further resources that FRC has produced can be found at frc.org/education. And these are some pamphlets, some materials that you need to be aware of on the issues facing some of the local schools, but also some steps they issue at the end for parents on steps you can take to address some of these things and some of these issues should you see them pop up in your local schools.
Yeah, the time is now to act.
Yes.
David, I'm going to give you the final 30 seconds to wrap up our conversation.
I'll just say, Tony, that our colleague George Barna, he says that someone's worldview is crystallized between the ages of 7 and 13. And I think we just need to realize that our children are worth fighting for. That's my biggest takeaway from this conversation is that our children are worth fighting for, and they're going to get that biblical worldview only if we're fighting for it. And I think we need to be about that business because it's worth it.
Yes, absolutely. David, Brent, thanks so much for joining us today.